Caleb Voss threw the divorce papers across the table and looked at his wife the way a man looks at something he owns that has suddenly stopped working. "You think a judge in this county is going to side with you?" he said. His voice was quiet. That was the worst part. How quiet it always was. "You think anyone in this town is going to believe a word that comes out of your mouth over mine?" Elena said nothing. She had learned, over 4 years of marriage, that saying nothing was safer. He picked up the baby from the cradle near the window, picked her up the way you'd pick up a hat you weren't sure you wanted to wear, and held her at arm's length, studying her with flat, disinterested eyes. "She doesn't even look like me," he said. Elena's hands tightened on the edge of the kitchen table. "Put her down, Caleb." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he only did when he wanted her to feel the distance between them, the difference in what they were worth, what they owned, who would be believed. "Or what?" he said. That was the night Elena Voss decided she would rather die in the open than live another year under that roof. If you've ever watched someone you love be treated like they didn't matter, if you've ever stood in a room where the most dangerous thing wasn't the weather outside, but the person standing next to you, then you already know what Elena was carrying the night she walked out of that house with her newborn daughter wrapped against her chest and nothing else. This is her story. And it's the story of a cowboy who had no reason to stop, but did. Before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling moves you, if you believe some stories deserve to be heard, take a second and subscribe to this channel. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling us what city or country you're watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. Wyatt Mercer had not slept in a real bed in 11 days. He wasn't bothered by that. He'd gone longer. There was a winter, years back, when he'd spent 3 weeks in the open hill country with nothing but a bedroll, a rifle, and a mule that hated him personally. By comparison, 11 days felt like a brief inconvenience. He had a good horse, a gray roan he called Patch on account of the uneven coloring across the animal's left shoulder, and the horse was steady, which was more than Wyatt could say for most people he'd ridden with. He was heading toward Caldwell, not because he had particular business there, but because he'd run out of reasons to be anywhere else. That was how Wyatt had navigated the last 8 years of his life, not toward things, but away from them. Away from the ranch in Nebraska that had stopped feeling like home after his father died, and his brother sold the land before the body was cold. Away from the cattle drives that paid well but left him hollowed out in a way he couldn't explain and didn't try to. Away from the woman in Abilene who'd looked at him once like he was worth something, and then married a banker because she had the good sense to want a settled life, and Wyatt had the good sense to understand he couldn't give her one. He was 34 years old and he owned a horse, a saddle, a rifle, a knife, enough money to last him 3 months if he was careful, and no debts. By the measure of most men he'd known on the trail, that was a fine position to be in. He told himself that often enough that some days he almost believed it. The Dakota Plains in late July were not kind country. The heat came off the ground in visible waves, and the sky was the particular shade of white-blue that meant the sun had burned off every trace of moisture and intended to keep burning. Patch moved at a measured walk, head slightly lowered, ears tracking small sounds in the grass. Insects, mostly. The occasional distant hawk. Once, a jackrabbit that erupted out of the scrub and nearly sent them both sideways. Wyatt didn't push the horse. He never pushed the horse. It was one of his few genuinely good qualities, his patience with animals, though he would not have listed it among his virtues because he didn't think much in terms of virtues. He was thinking about water. There was a creek marked on the rough map he carried, maybe 2 miles ahead, and he was calculating whether it was worth pushing slightly east to reach it or whether he could make Caldwell before sundown without the stop. He was running these numbers, not dramatic numbers, not life or death, just the small arithmetic of a man who'd spent enough time in hard country to think practically about things like water. When he heard it, he almost didn't register it as what it was. The plains made sounds, wind through grass, ground birds calling, the low moan of weather building in the distance. Wyatt had spent enough years out here that he processed those sounds the way most people process the noise of a familiar room, present but unimportant. But this was different. It was thin, high, and irregular, and weak, like something that had been crying for a long time and was beginning to lose the energy for it. It had a quality that was almost mechanical in its desperation. Not building, not releasing, just repeating, as if whatever was making that sound had forgotten how to stop. Wyatt pulled Patch up. He sat very still in the saddle and listened. The sound came again. Off to his left, maybe 40 yards, somewhere in the taller grass where the land dipped slightly toward a low depression. Not a bird, not a coyote, something else. He turned the horse. He told himself later, in the brief private moments when he actually examined his own choices, that he turned toward the sound without thinking, that it was reflex, not decision. That might have been true. Wyatt had spent enough of his life making himself not think too hard about things that the line between instinct and choice had blurred into something he couldn't cleanly trace anymore. But he turned. That part was certain. The grass was high enough in the depression that Patch's legs disappeared into it with each step, and Wyatt stood slightly in the stirrups, scanning ahead. The sound was closer now. Still that thin, exhausted cry. Interrupted, resumed, interrupted again. He saw the woman's hand first. It was extended at an odd angle, palm up, as if she'd reached for something and not quite made it. Her fingers were curled slightly, the way hands curl in sleep or in states beyond sleep. The skin was burned across the back of the hand, red and starting to blister, and there was dried blood along two of the knuckles. Wyatt dismounted before Patch had fully stopped. He pushed through the last stretch of grass and found her. She was young, younger than he'd expected, though he hadn't expected anything, he'd simply reacted. And she was lying on her side, knees drawn up, one arm curved around a small cloth bundle pressed against her stomach. Her hair was dark and loose and plastered to her face with sweat and dust. There was a cut above her left eyebrow that had bled down across her temple and dried there in a long, rust-colored trail. Her lips were cracked and whitened. Her breathing, when he crouched down and watched her chest, was shallow and too fast. The bundle against her stomach moved. Wyatt sat back on his heels and absorbed this information the way he absorbed most difficult information, without reaction, while his mind did the actual work underneath. He reached out carefully and folded back the edge of the cloth. The baby was maybe 3 weeks old, possibly less. Her face was red and scrunched, and she was doing that particular thing very young babies do when they've been crying for so long they've reached the edge of what their small bodies can produce. The cry was there, the motion was there, but the sound was fading in and out like a signal losing its source. Her skin was dry in a way that told him, even without any particular medical knowledge, that she needed water. She needed it soon. He looked at the woman. He looked at the baby. He looked back at the flat, empty distance he'd ridden across for the past several hours. The sun, the grass, the unbroken horizon in every direction. He was 2 miles from a creek and probably 9 miles from Caldwell. The woman needed a doctor. The baby needed water and feeding. He had a canteen and a horse and a bedroll and no useful expertise in any of the things that were currently required of him. He had exactly one useful thing. He was here. Wyatt pulled off his coat, the heavy canvas duster he wore even in summer because it kept the sun off his arms and had pockets large enough to carry the things he needed, and laid it on the ground beside him. He picked up the baby as carefully as he knew how, which was not expertly. He was aware of that. He'd held maybe 2 babies in his life, and neither occasion had prepared him particularly well for this one. But he held her against his chest, felt the warmth of her, the too light weight of her, and wrapped the coat loosely around her. The baby's crying didn't stop, but it shifted. Some quality of it changed, something less panicked and more simply miserable, which he chose to interpret as progress. He uncapped his canteen and lifted the woman's head with one hand and got a small amount of water into her, waiting, watching to make sure she swallowed and didn't choke. She made a sound, not quite conscious, but responsive. Her hand moved slightly against the ground. "That's good," he said, which was not a thing he'd normally say, but something about the situation seemed to require words even if there was nobody to hear them coherently. "We're going to get you somewhere. Just stay still." She didn't respond to that, which he expected. He managed the next 10 minutes with the kind of grim, improvised competence that is less about skill and more about being the only person available. He got the woman onto Patch with his help, mostly his, she was not much capable of helping, and positioned her as securely as he could manage, one arm around her waist to brace her, her body leaning forward along the horse's neck. He kept the baby wrapped in his coat and held her against his chest with the other arm. He walked patch rather than riding, which was slower and harder but kept the woman stable. The first mile was the worst. The sun was directly overhead, and there was no shade anywhere, and the woman drifted in and out in ways that frightened him more than he let register. He talked to her. He was not a man who talked much, generally, and he had nothing useful to say, but he'd heard somewhere, or read somewhere, or maybe just believed in the way people sometimes believe practical things without knowing where the belief came from, that voices kept people anchored. So he talked. About the creek ahead, about the town beyond it, about the fact that the baby was still making sounds, which was evidence of life, which was evidence that the situation was recoverable. The woman said nothing. The baby cried. Wyatt walked. They reached the creek. He got water into the woman properly this time, enough to see some color begin returning to her face, though she remained semi-conscious at best. He wet a strip of cloth from his saddlebag and let the baby draw what moisture she could from it. Not enough, he knew, but something. He cleaned the cut above the woman's eye as best he could with what he had, which was not much, and wrapped it with another strip of cloth to keep the wound from drawing flies. Then he got back on the horse, properly this time, with the woman in front of him rather than across the saddle, and he rode toward Caldwell. He arrived as the sun was going down. The town was not large. A main street, maybe 14 businesses, a livery, a hotel that called itself a hotel with some ambition, a doctor's office, which was the thing he was looking for. He found it based on nothing more than the painted sign, rode directly to the door, and didn't bother tying off the horse before he was inside, calling for whoever was there. The doctor was an older man named Parrish, late 60s, white-bearded, wearing a work apron stained in ways that Wyatt chose not to examine, who processed the situation with the quick, unruffled manner of a man who'd been practicing frontier medicine long enough that surprise had largely been processed out of him. "Get her in here," Parrish said. "Who is she?" "Don't know," Wyatt said. "Found them in the grass about 9 miles east. She's dehydrated badly. The baby's worse." "Both alive?" "So far." Parrish was already moving, directing the positioning of the woman on the examination table, lifting the baby from Wyatt's arms with the automatic competence of someone who'd done this version of emergency management many times before. Wyatt stepped back and found himself in the strange position of having nothing useful to do. He stood in the corner of the room and watched the doctor work and felt, for the first time since he'd heard that cry in the grass, the full weight of the last several hours land on him. His arms ached, his feet ached from the walking. There was dust caked into the creases of his neck and across the back of his hands. He was aware that he was hungry in a distant way, the way he got hungry when he'd been moving too hard to notice it in the moment. He thought, I could leave now. She was with the doctor. The baby was with the doctor. Whatever happened next was in better hands than his. He had done the thing, the basic, instinctive, human thing, and now there was no particular reason to remain. He had no connection to this woman. He didn't know her name. He didn't know what she'd been doing 9 miles from the nearest settlement, injured and half dead in the prairie grass with a newborn baby wrapped in cloth against her body. He could leave. Parrish looked up from across the room. "You the one who brought them in?" "Yes." "You know anything about what happened to her? The cut on her head didn't come from a fall. Not at that angle." Wyatt looked at the woman on the table, at the careful geometric line of the wound above her eye, at the darkening he'd noticed along her jaw that had nothing to do with sun. "No," he said. "I don't know what happened." But he had an idea. He left the doctor's office and stood on the porch of that small, ambition-named hotel and looked at the main street of Caldwell in the dying light. He should keep going. He had somewhere to be. Well, no, he didn't have somewhere to be, but that had never stopped him before from treating the next town over as a destination with sufficient pull. He stood there for a long time. Then he went back inside. "Is there somewhere I can wait?" he asked Parrish. The doctor looked at him over his glasses, some kind of assessment happening behind those old, tired eyes. Then he nodded toward a chair near the far wall. "There," he said. Wyatt sat. The baby's crying had softened into something less desperate. The woman's breathing, when he could hear it, had steadied. The room smelled of clean linen and something antiseptic, and the faint particular smell of dust that had settled on every surface and could not quite be removed. He waited. He told himself it was just until morning, just until he knew they were stable. He told himself things like that before. Around midnight, the woman came fully conscious. She came up out of it suddenly, the way people do when they've been under and surface all at once rather than gradually. Her eyes opened, and she grabbed for the edge of the table and said one word, immediate and sharp and panicked. Lily. The baby's here, Parrish said from across the room, already moving. She's right here. He brought the baby to her. Lily, apparently now Wyatt had a name for her. And something happened in the woman's face that he'd never forget. It was relief in its most stripped-down form. Not happiness. Not the softness of relief. Just the particular thing that happens to a person's face when they've been braced for the worst and it hasn't happened. That sudden, exhausted release of tension that looked almost like collapse. The woman held the baby and pressed her face into the soft cloth wrapping and didn't say anything else for a long moment. Then she looked up. She found Wyatt across the room. His coat was still around the baby, he noticed. He hadn't thought to retrieve it. And she looked at him the way people look at something they're trying to categorize quickly when they're not sure whether they're safe. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was rough from whatever state she'd been in. "Wyatt Mercer," he said. "I found you, out on the flats about 9 miles east." She absorbed this. Her eyes moved to Parrish, back to Wyatt, back to the baby. "How long?" "You've been here about 6 hours," Parrish said. "You're dehydrated, you have a moderate concussion, and that cut needed 3 stitches. The baby is doing better. She needs proper feeding, and I have a woman coming in the morning who can help with that." The woman, still unnamed to Wyatt, nodded. Her jaw was tight in a way that had nothing to do with pain, or maybe everything to do with pain of a different kind. "You carried us in?" she said to Wyatt. "Yes." "Why?" He considered that for a moment. It was a fair question. "Because you were there," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she was measuring, whatever calculation was running in the back of that exhausted mind, he didn't know. Then she looked back down at the baby. "Elena," she said quietly. "My name is Elena Voss." Wyatt nodded. He noted the name. He noted also the way she said it, with a slight hesitation before the last name, as if the name itself was something she was choosing whether to claim. He noted the bruising along her jaw. He noted the way she held the baby, not gently, not the loose ease of a woman comfortable with an infant, but tight. The way you hold something you're afraid someone is going to take from you. He didn't ask her what had happened. Not then. He sat back in his chair near the wall and let the room settle into the late-night quiet that a doctor's office acquires after the emergency has passed. Parrish moved around the room with quiet purpose. The baby made small sounds. The lamp burned low. Wyatt stayed where he was. He thought, one more night, just until morning. I was very good at telling himself things. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, sitting in that chair in that small dim room in Caldwell, Dakota Territory, watching a woman he didn't know hold a baby he'd wrapped in his own coat and carry them both out of the grass and back into the world, was that morning was not going to end this. That the man who'd put those bruises on Elena Voss's jaw was already aware she was gone, that he had people who would find her, and that by morning, Wyatt Mercer's quiet, uncomplicated life of not belonging to anyone was going to become something else entirely. But that was morning. Tonight, in the small warmth of Parrish's office, with the prairie dark and enormous outside, a cowboy who hadn't meant to stop sat in a chair against the wall and waited. That single choice, turning his horse toward a sound in the grass, had already redrawn the map of what his life was going to look like. He just didn't know it yet. The lamp burned. The baby breathed. Elena Voss lay on the table with her daughter held against her chest, and her eyes open in the dark, staring at something none of them could see. And outside, on the road between Nowhere and Caldwell, a rider was already moving through the night. Wyatt was still in the chair when morning came. He hadn't slept, not really. He drifted a few times into that half state that wasn't rest so much as the body insisting on a minimum, and each time he'd come back to the same room, the same lamp burning lower, the same sound of Elena's breathing across the space between them. Parrish had gone to sleep in the back around 2 in the morning, leaving the door open in a way that said he trusted the situation not to require him immediately. Wyatt had sat with that trust and done nothing to betray it. Elena hadn't slept either. He knew that without looking at her directly. He could tell from the quality of the silence she produced. It was an awake silence, watchful, the silence of a person monitoring something. Around dawn, when the light had gone from black to gray to the particular pale gold that meant actual morning, she spoke. "You're still here," she said. "Yes." "I thought you'd go." He didn't have a clean answer for that, so he didn't offer one. She seemed to accept the non-answer as sufficient. The woman Parrish had mentioned arrived shortly after, a Mrs. Alderman, stout and brisk and uninterested in ceremony, who took Lily with the efficiency of someone who'd nursed half the county's children and had opinions about it. Elena watched her handle the baby with the same tight, careful attention she'd given everything since she'd regained consciousness. Not hostile, just watching, just making sure. Wyatt stepped outside to give them the room. He stood on the porch of Parrish's office and looked at Caldwell waking up. The street was still mostly quiet, the hour too early for commerce, though a man was sweeping the front steps of the general store and a dog was investigating something near the livery with focused interest. It was, by the evidence of his senses, an ordinary morning in an ordinary small town. He checked on Patch, who was in the livery, and who acknowledged his arrival with mild reproach at the quality of the hay situation. Wyatt arranged for better hay and fresh water, and stood with the horse for a few minutes in the particular comfortable silence that was available with animals and almost never with people. Then he went back. Parrish was up, moving around his office with morning efficiency, reviewing something in a small leather notebook. He looked at Wyatt over his glasses. "She told me some of it," the doctor said, keeping his voice low. "Last night, while you were sleeping." "I wasn't sleeping." "Fine, while you were resting your eyes." Parrish set the notebook down. "Her husband is Caleb Voss. You know that name?" Wyatt didn't. "You would if you'd spent any time in Harding County. He runs about 4,000 acres up there. Cattle, some grain, enough money to mean his opinions carry weight with people who should know better than to let them." The doctor paused. "She left 9 days ago, walked out with the baby and whatever she could carry and didn't look back. 9 days. She made it further than I'd have expected, honestly. She had some money put aside, took a wagon as far as she could afford, then walked." Wyatt looked at the closed door between the front room and the examination area. "What did he do to her?" Parrish was quiet for a moment in a way that contained the answer before he gave it. "Enough," he said. "Enough that she didn't see another option." Wyatt nodded. He looked at his hands, still dusty at the knuckles, still marked from the walk across the flats. He thought about the angle of that cut above her eye, the measured, controlled voice Caleb Voss had used. Wyatt didn't know the man, hadn't heard him speak, but he knew the type from the evidence of what that voice had produced. Quiet men. Men whose danger was in the precision of it. "Is she going to be all right?" he asked. "Physically, she'll recover. The concussion is mild. The dehydration was the serious one." Parrish picked up his notebook again. "The rest of it takes longer." Wyatt sat down in the chair near the door. He thought about Caldwell. He thought about the road to wherever he'd been going, which he'd already largely stopped thinking of as a real destination. He thought about Patch, and the hay situation, and the fact that he had enough money for 3 months if he was careful, and that 3 months from now, none of this would have anything to do with him. He thought about the baby's weight against his chest the night before, the too-light, bird-bone specificity of it. He stayed in the chair. Elena came out around mid-morning, moving carefully, one hand briefly touching the wall for balance before she straightened and made herself walk without it. She was wearing a dress that Mrs. Alderman had produced from somewhere, clean, a little large, practical, and her dark hair was pulled back. The stitched cut above her eye was visible, and the bruising along her jaw had darkened overnight the way bruises do, going from bad to worse before they start going the other direction. She looked around the front room and found Wyatt, and didn't appear surprised to see him, which meant she'd been thinking about it in the back room and had reached some conclusion. "Dr. Parrish says I can stay here 2 more days," she said. "Then I need to make arrangements." "What kind of arrangements?" "I don't know yet." She sat down in the chair across from his. Not the closest chair, not the furthest, the middle distance of someone who was deciding how much of the space between them to close. "I have $17. That's what I have." He didn't say anything to that. "I'm not asking you for anything," she said quickly, and there was something in the speed of it that told him she'd said versions of that sentence before, in other rooms, to people whose help had always come attached to conditions she couldn't meet. I know that, he said. She looked at him. You don't know me, she said. No. Then why are you still here? It was the same question she'd asked last night, more or less. He still didn't have a clean answer. He had the honest one, which was that he didn't entirely know, and the practical one, which was that leaving felt wrong in a way he couldn't argue himself out of, and neither of those was especially satisfying to say out loud. I'm not sure yet, he said. She absorbed that the same way she'd absorbed the non-answer at dawn, without pushing it, without apparent disappointment, as if honesty without clarity was something she'd learned to accept as a reasonable substitute for certainty. They sat in the moderate quiet of Parrish's front room, and the morning moved around them. The first sign of trouble came 2 days later, on the afternoon Elena was due to leave Parrish's care. Wyatt was at the general store buying supplies. Not for a journey, just supplies. He'd stopped framing things in terms of journeys when he overheard 2 men at the counter talking about a rider who'd come into town the previous evening. Big man, good horse, asking questions about a woman with a newborn. He bought his supplies without changing his expression and walked back to Parrish's office at a pace that was not running but was also not his normal pace. He told Elena directly. He'd learned in 2 days that she didn't need anything softened. She went still when he said it, the kind of stillness that wasn't calm but was the opposite of it, every part of her quiet and the inside loud. How long? She said. I don't know. Whoever it was came in last night. Could be Voss himself or someone he sent. He'd send someone first, she said, and the certainty in her voice told him she'd spent time thinking about exactly how Caleb Voss operated. He'd want to know where I was before he came himself. He likes to know things in advance. A short pause. He likes to arrive when you're not ready. Wyatt thought about that. Do you have anywhere to go? Anyone? She looked at her hands in her lap. I have a cousin in Wyoming. We haven't spoken in 3 years. I don't know if... She stopped. I don't have anywhere certain. Wyatt had been making decisions by instinct for long enough that he'd stopped expecting them to feel logical before he made them. He made one now. Then stay, he said. In Caldwell. For now. She looked up at him. On what? Let me figure that out. Mr. Mercer, I have money, he said. It wasn't elegant, but it was true. I have enough, and I don't have a particular use for it at the moment. She looked at him for a long time. He could see her working through it, the suspicion, the calculation, the history of what happened when men offered things. And he let her work through it without trying to shortcut it. Whatever conclusion she reached on her own was going to be sturdier than anything he could argue her into. Why would you do that? She said finally. Because running out of Caldwell right now puts you on the open road with $17 and a 3-week-old baby and someone already looking for you, he said. And that ends badly. You know it ends badly. A muscle in her jaw moved. She knew. I'm not asking for charity, she said. Then call it practical, he said. You need time to make a real plan. I'm providing time, that's all. She looked at him for another long moment. Then she looked at Lily, who was in the small cradle Parrish had provided, making the small, non-urgent sounds of a baby who had been fed and was considering sleep. 2 weeks, she said. I'll figure something out in 2 weeks. All right, he said. He found her a room at the boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Cutter, who was 60, sharp-tongued, and precisely the kind of woman who would notice strangers asking questions and have opinions about it. He paid 2 weeks in advance without telling Elena the amount, and when she pressed him on it, he gave her a lower number than the actual one. She seemed to know he was doing that and didn't push it, which told him her pride had limits that her intelligence had approved of. He took a room at the same boarding house. Mrs. Cutter raised one eyebrow, looked at Wyatt, looked in the direction of Elena's room, and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement. Caldwell was not a town that paid excessive attention to strangers. It was too close to enough through traffic for any single passing face to merit sustained interest. But Elena attracted attention anyway. Not hostile attention, not immediately. Just the particular quality of notice that a woman alone with a very young baby generates in a small town, which is partly concern and partly curiosity and partly something less generous than either. Wyatt watched how she handled it. She was careful. Careful in the way of someone who'd learned that drawing attention could be dangerous, who'd developed a way of moving through spaces that was efficient and pleasant and revealed as little as possible. She smiled at the right moments, and answered questions without answering them. Not lies, exactly, just the minimum of truth necessary to satisfy the question and redirect the conversation. She was good at it. He found that more disturbing than reassuring. On the fourth day in Caldwell, a man named Driscoll introduced himself at the boarding house breakfast table. He was 40 or so, lean, well-dressed for a town of Caldwell's size, with the particular manner of a man who considered himself a good judge of other men and wanted that quality acknowledged. He'd been in town 3 days, he said, land business. He was interested in Elena in a way he worked to make look like ordinary politeness. Wyatt watched him work at it across the breakfast table, watched the questions that seemed casual and weren't, the way he angled toward information about where she was from and whether she had family in the area and how long she planned to stay. Elena answered with her careful minimum, smiled her appropriate smile, and ate her breakfast with the composed attention of someone who had recognized exactly what was happening and had decided the best response was perfect normalcy. After breakfast, when Driscoll had gone out, Wyatt found Elena on the boarding house porch with Lily. "He's one of Voss's men," she said, before he could say anything. Her voice was flat, certain. "You're sure?" "I've seen him. At the house. Twice." She was looking at the street, not at Wyatt. "Caleb uses men like him. Presentable. Good at seeming like something else." Wyatt leaned against the porch railing and considered Driscoll and what Driscoll represented, which was that Caleb Voss had located his wife faster than either of them had expected and had sent someone sufficiently capable to do it without announcing himself. "He doesn't know you've recognized him," Wyatt said. "No, I don't think so." "Then we have a little time." "Time for what?" She turned to look at him then, and there was something in her face that was not quite despair but was in the territory adjacent to it. "He'll send word back to Caleb. Caleb will come. He has friends here, Wyatt. He has money, and he has the law, and he has the way people in this territory think about a wife who left her husband." Her jaw was tight. "I've thought about all of this. I left anyway because staying was worse, but I knew what I was running toward." It was the most she'd said at once since he'd known her. He let it settle. "What do you want to happen?" he said. "If you could make it anything." She looked at him like the question was slightly absurd. Then she looked down at Lily. "I want her to grow up not afraid," she said. "That's it. That's the whole thing." Wyatt nodded. He went to find Parrish that afternoon. The doctor was in his office, alone, making notes in that leather book. He looked up when Wyatt came in and closed the book without being asked, which suggested he'd anticipated the conversation. "Driscoll," Wyatt said. "I know who he is," Parrish said. "He was in here this morning asking after my patients in the last 2 weeks. I told him I don't discuss my patients." "Voss will come." "Probably." "What happens when he does?" Parrish was quiet in his careful way. "Legally, she's his wife. He has standing. A judge in Harding County would give him standing. A judge here—" He paused. "It depends on the judge, and I won't lie to you about that, Mr. Mercer. This is complicated territory for a woman in her situation." "What would make it less complicated?" The doctor studied him. "Why are you asking me that?" Wyatt didn't answer right away. He was asking because something was forming in the back of his thinking. Not a plan, not yet, just the shape of one, the outline of something that might work or might be the worst idea he'd ever had. "Hypothetically," he said. Parrish sat back. He looked at Wyatt for a long moment with those old, tired, seen-everything eyes. "Hypothetically," he said, "a married woman has more standing than a runaway wife. Hypothetically, a husband who arrived to find his wife already remarried would be in a considerably more complicated legal position than one arriving to collect property." He paused. "That's hypothetically." Wyatt nodded slowly. "That's not a small thing," Parrish said. "What you're thinking." "No." "She'd have to agree to it." "Yes." "And you'd have to mean it enough to stand behind it when Voss's lawyers showed up and made it ugly." "Yes." Parrish looked at him for another moment. Then he picked up his notebook again. "Well," he said, in the tone of a man declining to offer his opinion because the person asking had already made his decision and the opinion was beside the point, "you'd better talk to her then." Wyatt walked back to the boarding house in the early evening, when the light was doing the thing it did out here in late summer, going golden and sideways and making everything look softer than it was. He walked without rushing. He let himself think about what he was considering, which was significant. which was the kind of significant that didn't unhappen if it went wrong. He was 34 years old. He had not come to Caldwell. He had not planned to stop. He had heard a sound in the grass and turned his horse, and now he was standing in the evening light outside a boarding house in a town he hadn't known existed 2 weeks ago, thinking about proposing marriage to a woman he'd known for 10 days. He had made worse decisions. He wasn't sure when exactly, but he felt confident it was true. Elena was on the porch again when he got there. She'd been on the porch a lot. He'd noticed that, how she liked the open air, the unobstructed sightlines. What some people might read as an enjoyment of fresh air was something else. It was the same thing he did in unfamiliar rooms, identified the exits first. He sat down in the chair beside her. She looked at him, read something in his face, and waited. He told her what he'd been thinking. He was direct about it because directness was the only honest way to have this conversation, and she deserved honesty more than she deserved smoothness. He told her what Parrish had said. He told her what it would and wouldn't mean, that he was offering protection, legal standing, a wall between her and the machinery Caleb Voss would use to get her back. He was not offering her a claim on him. He was not asking for a claim on her. He was offering her a choice, which might be the thing she had least of right now. When he finished, she was quiet. Lily was asleep in her arms. The street was going dark. Somewhere down the block, someone was cooking something that smelled of onion and wood smoke. "You don't know me," she said again. But it was different from the last 2 times. Less a challenge and more something she was saying to herself. "I know enough," he said. "That's not true." "Maybe not. But I know you walked 9 miles with a newborn baby rather than spend another night in that house. I know you had $17 and you were still going. I know you—" He stopped, found the words. "I know what kind of person does that." She was quiet again. A long quiet. "I'm not easy," she said finally. I don't trust easily. I don't—" She stopped. "You should know that. If you're going to say this, you should know that going in." "I'm not easy either," he said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. "I'm not going to pretend it's something it isn't," she said. I'm not asking you to." She looked at him. Whatever was happening behind her eyes was complicated and probably would have taken her an hour to articulate, and she didn't try to articulate it. "Why?" she said. Not an accusation, just the real question, underneath all the other ones. He thought about his answer for a moment. "Because you needed someone to turn their horse," he said, "and I was there. And I find I'm still there." He looked at Lily. "I don't want her to grow up afraid either, if that helps." Elena looked down at her daughter. The evening settled around them. The street went quiet. Mrs. Cutter could be heard moving around inside the house, opinionated footsteps on old floorboards. "You'd need to mean it," Elena said. "When he comes, and he will come, you'd need to actually mean it. He'll look for any weakness, any hesitation. Her jaw tightened. "He's very good at finding the weak point in a wall. Then we make sure the wall doesn't have one," Wyatt said. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "All right." Just those 2 words. Not warm, not relieved, not happy. Those were not things the situation could honestly produce. Just the plain acceptance of a woman who'd been making hard choices long enough to recognize one when it was in front of her and make it cleanly. "All right," she said again, "if that's what it takes." He nodded. They sat there on the porch as the last light left the sky, not touching, not speaking, 2 people who had arrived at an agreement that neither of them had planned for, and both of them intended to honor. Driscoll left Caldwell the following morning. Elena watched him go from the window of her room, and Wyatt watched her watch him, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, that the clock had started, and they had whatever time it took for Driscoll to ride back to Harding County and tell Caleb Voss what he'd found. Parrish married them 2 days later in his office, with Mrs. Cutter and the livery owner as witnesses. It was not romantic. It was not supposed to be. The doctor read the words with the serious attention he gave to most practical necessities, and Elena said what she was supposed to say in a clear, steady voice that didn't waver, and Wyatt said the same. And it was done. Mrs. Cutter had brought a small cake, because she was that kind of woman regardless of her opinions, and nobody had asked her to, and nobody remarked on it, and they ate a little of it in Parrish's front room with the afternoon sun coming through the windows and Lily sleeping in the corner, and that was the wedding. That night, in the narrow hallway between their rooms at the boarding house, rooms they maintained separately, as agreed, as understood, Elena stopped before going in and turned to look at him. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what else to say." "You don't have to say anything else." She nodded. Her hand was on the doorknob. "I mean to pay you back. All of it. When I can." "I know you do," he said. She went in. He heard the door close, the small sounds of a woman getting a baby settled for the night. He went to his own room and lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about what his life had consisted of, and what it consisted of now, and the very large distance between those two things. He had been married for about 4 hours. He had a wife he'd known for 12 days. A daughter who shared neither his blood nor his name, but who had been wrapped in his coat and carried across 9 miles of open country while her mother was unconscious on a horse. He had, apparently, a direction. He wasn't sure how he felt about that. He tested the feeling and found it was less alarming than he'd expected, which either meant he'd made a reasonable decision or that he was too tired to feel the full weight of it yet. Down the hall, Lily made a small sound, then quiet. Somewhere to the north, on a road through dark country, a man named Driscoll was riding toward Harding County with news that was going to produce a particular response in a particular man. Wyatt lay on his ceiling-staring bed and did not pretend he wasn't thinking about that. He was. He was thinking about Caleb Voss, what kind of man he was, how he moved, what he valued, what he would and would not do when he arrived in Caldwell, and found that the thing he considered his property had made herself legally unreachable. He thought about what Elena had said. He looks for the weak point in a wall. Wyatt closed his eyes. He thought, we are going to need to be a very solid wall. He thought, I have never been someone's wall before. He thought, I had better figure out how. Caleb Voss arrived on a Thursday. Wyatt knew he was coming before he saw him, not from any particular instinct, but from the practical fact that Mrs. Cutter had mentioned a stranger's horse tied outside the hotel that morning, a very good horse, the kind that costs more than most men in Caldwell earned in a year. And in Wyatt's experience, men who rode horses like that into small towns were either lost or looking for something, and the lost ones usually asked for directions at the general store rather than checking into the hotel and waiting. He told Elena at breakfast. She put down her fork and sat very still for a moment, and then she picked it back up and finished eating, which he'd come to understand was how she handled things. The stillness first, like a door closing over something, and then the ordinary motion resuming, because stopping entirely was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. "Does Lily need anything this morning?" she asked. "She's fine," he said. "Mrs. Alderman is with her." Elena nodded. She drank her coffee. Her hands were steady, which he suspected cost her something. They didn't talk about Caleb Voss again over breakfast. There wasn't anything useful to say that they hadn't already said, and they had both, in their different ways, been preparing for this since Driscoll rode out of Caldwell 2 weeks ago. You can only prepare so much for a thing. At some point, the preparing is just a way of making yourself feel less helpless, and Elena was too clear-eyed for that kind of comfort. He came to Parrish's office first. Wyatt heard about it afterward from Parrish himself, who described it with the flat precision of a man who had been around enough difficult people to recognize the type and was not impressed by the performance. Caleb Voss had walked into the office around 9 in the morning, polite, well-dressed, the kind of surface that read as reasonable from a distance. He'd introduced himself, stated that he was looking for his wife and daughter, and asked whether the doctor had treated a woman named Elena in the past several weeks. Parrish had said yes. Caleb had absorbed this without visible reaction. "Is she still in town?" "You'd need to ask her that," Parrish said. "She's my wife." "She's a patient," Parrish said. "Those aren't the same thing from where I'm standing." Caleb Voss had looked at him then, really looked at him, the measuring kind of look, and smiled. It was, Parrish told Wyatt, the kind of smile that wasn't meant to be warm. It was meant to communicate that the smiling man understood exactly what was happening and was patient enough to wait for it to stop mattering. "I appreciate your discretion, Doctor," Caleb had said. "I'll find her another way." He left without another word. Wyatt was at the livery when Caleb Voss walked past on the street, which gave him his first look at the man without being seen himself. He stood back in the dim of the stable and watched through the open door. Caleb was not what he'd imagined, which meant he'd imagined wrong, which was a useful correction. He'd expected something physically imposing, big, loud in some way, the exterior matching the interior. Caleb was none of those things. He was medium height, lean without being slight, 40 or thereabouts, with the kind of unremarkable face that would be difficult to describe from memory. He was dressed well but not flashily. He walked at an unhurried pace, hands easy at his sides, looking at the town with the relaxed attention of a man who had nothing to worry about because he had already decided how things were going to go. That was the part that was imposing, not anything physical, just the absolute, settled certainty in the way he moved. Wyatt watched him walk the length of the main street and go into the hotel, and stood there for a moment afterward, recalibrating. He found Elena at the boarding house, in the sitting room off the front hall where she sometimes read in the afternoons. She looked up when he came in, read his face, and closed her book. "You saw him," she said. "Yes." "And?" He sat down. "He's going to try the legal route first. He's not going to do anything loud. It's not his style, based on what you've told me." "No," she said. "It's never been his style." She said it without inflection, but there was something underneath it, something that had lived with his style for 4 years and knew exactly what it meant. "He'll find out about the marriage. He'll come to us. He'll be—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Reasonable. He'll seem completely reasonable. And then he'll start pulling things apart." "What kind of things?" "Anything he can. He'll question the marriage, the timing, the legality, whether it was coerced. He'll make it about what kind of man you are, because he can't make it about what kind of man he is." She looked at her hands. "He's very good at making the other person look like the problem." Wyatt had spent the past 2 weeks building something like a wall, as he'd told himself he would. He'd talked to the county clerk and understood what documentation they had. He'd talked to a lawyer in the next town over, a man named Greer, careful and competent, and understood what legal standing the marriage provided and where the edges of that standing were. He'd talked to people in Caldwell who knew Elena now, even slightly, because a community's knowledge of a person was a kind of evidence in its own right. He had done the things you do when you know something is coming and you want to be ready. But sitting across from Elena in that sitting room, watching her hold herself together with the particular careful discipline of a woman who'd been holding herself together for a long time, he understood that the wall he'd built was legal and practical and real, and Caleb Voss was going to come at it from an angle he hadn't fully anticipated, because Caleb Voss had spent 4 years learning exactly how Elena worked, and he would use that knowledge the same way he used everything, precisely and without hesitation. "He'll try to talk to you alone," Wyatt said. "He'll find a way to do it where I'm not there." "I know." "If he does, Wyatt," she looked at him directly, "I know what he does. I know every version of it. I'm not going to fall apart in front of him if that's what you're worried about." "That's not what I was going to say." She waited. "I was going to say that if he gets you alone, it doesn't change anything. Whatever he says, whatever argument he makes. The marriage is legal, the paperwork is filed, Greer has a copy. None of that changes because he has a conversation with you." She was quiet for a moment. "You think I need reminding of that?" "I think," he said carefully, "that he's going to say things designed to make you doubt what's real. And I think you know that. And I think sometimes knowing something isn't enough when the person saying it has been the loudest voice in the room for 4 years." She looked at him for a long time. Something moved in her face that she controlled before it became fully visible. "That's fair," she said quietly. Caleb Voss came to them the following morning. He knocked on the boarding house door at 9 o'clock. Mrs. Cutter answered it, told him that her guests were not receiving visitors, and he smiled his reasonable smile and said he was family. And Mrs. Cutter looked at him the way she looked at most things that tried to get past her, which was to say without any particular softening, and told him to wait on the porch. She came and found Wyatt and told him there was a man outside claiming to be Elena's husband. "He is," Wyatt said, "her former husband." Mrs. Cutter absorbed the distinction with a small nod that contained a volume of opinion. "You want me to send him away?" "No," Wyatt said. "Tell him we'll be out in a few minutes." He went and found Elena, who was already up, already dressed, who had heard the knock and known what it was, the same way you know certain sounds when you've been listening for them long enough. "We go out together?" Wyatt said. "We stay together." She nodded. They went out to the porch. Caleb Voss was standing at the porch railing, looking at the street. He turned when they came out, and his face did the thing Elena had predicted. It arranged itself into something that read as reasonable, even warm, the face of a man who was sorry for the difficulty and hoped they could resolve it simply. "Elena," he said. "Caleb," she said. Her voice was flat, controlled. His eyes moved to Wyatt. He took his time with the assessment, which was itself a move, making Wyatt wait to be acknowledged, establishing who was doing the evaluating. "You must be Mercer," he said. "That's right." "Caleb Voss?" He didn't offer his hand. "I believe you've been caring for my wife." "Your former wife," Wyatt said. "Elena is my wife." Something moved in Caleb's face. It wasn't anger. It was too controlled for anger. It was the adjustment of a man who had received information he'd expected but had hoped was wrong. "That's quite a claim," he said, "given the circumstances." "It's recorded with the county clerk," Wyatt said. "Our lawyer has a copy. Dr. Parrish performed the ceremony. Mrs. Cutter and the livery owner witnessed it." He let that settle. "It's not a claim. It's a fact." Caleb looked at Elena. "You want to explain this to me?" "I don't think I need to explain anything to you," she said. "You left," he said. "You took our daughter and you left without—" "I left," she said, "because staying would have eventually killed me. You know that." The temperature of the porch changed, not from anything visible. Caleb Voss didn't raise his voice, didn't move, didn't alter the surface of his expression by anything dramatic. But something underneath shifted, some quality of the attention he was paying, and Wyatt felt it the way you feel weather coming before there's any physical evidence of it. "That's a serious accusation," Caleb said quietly. "It's not an accusation. It's a description." "Elena." He said her name the way you say a child's name when you're running out of patience with a misunderstanding. "You're not well. You haven't been well. I think some time away from—" "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't do that," she said. Her voice had gone very quiet, and Wyatt recognized in it the particular quiet of someone who had been talked to that way for years, and had finally located the place in themselves where that talk couldn't reach anymore. "I'm not confused. I'm not unwell. I know exactly where I am and what I'm doing." Caleb looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Wyatt. "You understand," he said pleasantly, "that I intend to contest this marriage. The timing alone is—" "Contest it in court," Wyatt said. "That's the right place for it." "I will," Caleb said. "I want you to understand that. I have lawyers in Bismarck. I have relationships in this territory that go back 15 years. He said it without heat, like a man reading from a list of relevant facts. "I'm not going to make this easy." "We're not asking you to," Wyatt said. Something flickered behind Caleb's eyes. He'd been expecting, Wyatt thought, some version of backing down, some crack in the wall to work his fingers into. The absence of one was information he was now processing. "I'd like to see Lily," he said. "No," Elena said. "She's my daughter." "You can raise that with the court," Wyatt said, "along with everything else." Caleb looked at them both. The reasonable face had not gone away, but it had thinned slightly, become more visible as a performance rather than a state of being. Underneath it, something patient and deliberate and cold was doing the actual calculations. "All right," he said, "then that's how we'll do it." He left the porch without another word. They watched him walk back toward the hotel, unhurried, hands easy at his sides, the same settled certainty in his stride that Wyatt had seen through the livery door the day before. Elena was quiet beside him. He looked at her. Her jaw was tight and her hands were clenched at her sides, and she was breathing with the controlled steadiness of someone who had been holding something very large at bay for the last 10 minutes and was not quite ready to let herself stop. "You did well," he said. "Don't," she said. He waited. "Don't tell me I did well. He's going to—" She stopped, started again. "He has a lawyer in Bismarck named Harlow, who is very good at making things look like what they're not. He used him before. For a land dispute, It doesn't matter. Harlow is good." She turned to look at Wyatt. "How good is Greer?" "Good enough," Wyatt said. "And Greer knows what he's dealing with, which helps." "Does he know about Harlow?" "I'll make sure he does." She nodded. She unclenched her hands, one finger at a time, a deliberate release of tension that she was clearly managing actively. "He called me unwell," she said. "He always does that. Makes it about my—" She stopped. He does it so well that sometimes I've believed it. That's the worst part, that there were times I actually believed him. You don't now, Wyatt said. No. She said it firmly, then quieter. No, I don't. The next 10 days were a different kind of difficult. Caleb Voss stayed in Caldwell. This was itself a move. His presence in the town was a constant reminder that the situation was unresolved, and it had a visible effect on some of the people Elena had begun to know. Not hostility, exactly. More the careful social distance that people keep when they don't want to be involved in something that looks complicated. There were exceptions. Mrs. Cutter was not one for careful distance under any circumstances, and continued to treat Elena with exactly the same sharp-tongued, cake-bringing consistency she'd shown from the start. Parrish was immovable. Mrs. Alderman, who'd been helping with Lily since the beginning, looked at Caleb Voss when she passed him on the street with the specific expression of a woman who has already formed her opinion and sees no reason to revisit it. But the feed store owner, who had been friendly to Elena in the first week, found reasons to be busy when she came in. The woman who ran the laundry service sent word that she was overextended and couldn't take new customers. Small things, social things, the kind of things that didn't show up in court but built a picture. He's talking to people, Elena told Wyatt one evening. I don't know what he's saying, but I can see the result. What do you think he's saying? She was quiet for a moment. That I'm unstable, that I took Lily without cause, that he's worried about her welfare. A short pause. He'll be very sympathetic when he says it, very concerned. People respond to that. Some people, Wyatt said. Enough people. He didn't argue with her. She was right, and they both knew it, and pretending otherwise would have been a comfort neither of them had agreed to deal in. He went to see Greer again, rode the 8 miles to Millhaven, where the lawyer kept his office, and spent 2 hours going through what they had and where it was weak. Greer was a methodical man, narrow-faced and precise, the kind of lawyer who made up for not being dramatic by being extremely thorough, which Wyatt respected. The marriage is solid, Greer said, filed correctly, witnessed properly, nothing procedurally wrong with it. Harlow, if he gets Harlow, and he will, is going to argue it was contracted under duress, that the timeline indicates coercion, that Mrs. Mercer's mental state at the time was compromised. What do we have against that? Parrish's medical notes. His assessment of her mental competence at the time of the marriage. The fact that she was ambulatory, coherent, and made the decision over a period of 2 days, not in a moment of crisis. He turned a page in his notes. What we need more of is character testimony, people who can speak to her state of mind, people who interacted with her and found her sound. Mrs. Cutter. Yes, she'd be excellent. Who else? They worked through the list. It was shorter than Wyatt would have liked and longer than he'd feared. And Voss, Wyatt said, what do we have there? Greer was quiet in a considering way. He's careful. He's been careful for years. People in Harding County either like him or are afraid to say they don't. He turned another page. The medical evidence, the injuries Parrish documented when she came in, that's the strongest thing we have. But Harlow will argue they came from the journey, that she hurt herself on the road. The angle of the cut isn't consistent with Wyatt said. Parrish said that himself. Parrish saying it in this room and Parrish saying it in court with Harlow asking the questions are two different things. Greer looked at him. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Mercer. We have a reasonable case. We don't have a certain one. Wyatt nodded. He hadn't expected a certain one. Certainty was not something life in open country had trained him to expect. Then we build it better, he said. What do we need? The thing they needed, Greer explained, was documentation. Written records. Anything that had existed before Elena left. Anything that showed the pattern of what she'd lived with, in dates and specifics rather than descriptions. Wyatt brought this back to Elena that evening, and she listened to it carefully. There was a doctor in Harding County, she said. I went 3 times in 2 years, once for a broken finger. He told me I'd fallen, and I told the doctor the same thing because Caleb was in the room. She paused. Once for bruised ribs, once for... It doesn't matter what for. The doctor will have records. The doctor was also half afraid of Caleb, she said. I don't know if he'll cooperate. Greer can subpoena them. If they exist, we can get them. She was looking at the wall across from where she sat, at something that wasn't there. There were women, she said, in Harding County, who knew, who saw things, Not who were told. Who saw. She was quiet for a moment. I don't know if they'd say so publicly. He has influence there. Their husbands have business with him in some cases. Would any of them talk to Greer? A long pause. Maybe one, she said. A woman named Ruth Callan. Her husband has a small spread north of Caleb's land. She brought me soup once, after a bad time, and she didn't say anything. She just left it at the door, but I knew. She looked at Wyatt. She knew. I'll have Greer reach out. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at her hands. This is going to be in front of people, she said. Whatever happens. People are going to hear all of it. Yes, he said. He wasn't going to lie to her about that. I spent 4 years. She stopped, started differently. I spent 4 years making sure nobody heard it, keeping it contained, making it look like everything was fine because the alternative was worse. She looked up at him. Now it has to be not contained. Yes. She was quiet. I don't know if I can do that, she said. It was the most unguarded thing she'd said to him, and she said it with the kind of honesty that cost something. You walked 9 miles, he said. She looked at him. You had nothing, and you walked 9 miles with a newborn baby in July heat, he said. You can stand in a courtroom and tell the truth. Her jaw tightened. Not against him. Against the thing he was describing, the size of it. That's not the same thing, she said. No, he admitted. It's harder, because people will be watching. She sat with that for a moment. Will you be there? She said. When it happens? Yes, he said, without hesitation. She nodded once. Something settled in her, not resolution exactly, but the decision to move toward resolution. Caleb Voss made his next move 4 days later. He filed papers with the territorial court in Bismarck. Wyatt heard about it from Greer, who'd been keeping his ear to the right places. The filing contested the marriage on grounds of coercion and challenged Elena's fitness as a sole custodian of Lily. It was Harlow's work, Greer said. You could tell by the particular way it was constructed. Not crude, not aggressive, just precise, finding the joints and pressing them. It also contained something Wyatt hadn't expected. There were statements from 2 men in Harding County, men whose names Wyatt didn't recognize, but Elena did, when he showed her, testifying to Wyatt's character, or rather testifying against it. One described a bar fight in a town called Renner 4 years back. The other described a dispute over wages on a cattle drive that had turned ugly. Neither account was entirely false, Wyatt acknowledged to himself. Both were framed to suggest a man with a volatile temper and a pattern of aggression. Elena read both statements carefully. Are they true? She said. Versions of them, he said. The Renner thing. There was a fight. I didn't start it, but I finished it more thoroughly than I needed to. The wages dispute. There was a foreman who was shorting the crew. I had words with him. More than words? He paused. Some more. She nodded slowly. He found them quickly, she said. That means he had people looking into you before Driscoll came back. Maybe before he even knew about the marriage. She looked up. He started investigating you as soon as he knew someone helped me. Wyatt hadn't fully considered this. He did now. He wanted to know what he was dealing with before he arrived, he said. He always does his research, she said. It's one of the things that makes him... She didn't finish the sentence. Greer's response, when Wyatt consulted him, was measured. It's a character play. He's trying to establish you as a risk factor, to Elena, to Lily, to the integrity of the marriage. It shifts the narrative from his behavior to yours. He turned his pen in his fingers. We counter it with character testimony of our own, and we make sure the court has his behavior on the record, not just yours. How do we do that? Ruth Callan, Greer said, if she'll testify. He rode to Millhaven and sent a letter through Greer's office to an address in Harding County. They waited. In the meantime, Caleb Voss remained in Caldwell. He was courteous to everyone he spoke to. He expressed concern about his daughter's welfare to anyone who would listen. He drank moderately in the hotel bar and paid his bills promptly and gave money to the collection that was being raised for a family who'd lost their barn to fire. Wyatt watched him do all of it and understood that this was the actual fight. Not the legal documents, not the courtroom that was coming, but this. The daily construction of a version of Caleb Voss that Caldwell would believe in, against which Elena's version would seem like one woman's bitter interpretation of an ordinary man's ordinary life. He talked to people himself. Not campaigning, he wasn't built for that kind of social performance and would have done it badly. But he had conversations. He was honest when people asked him questions, which they did, because the situation was generating curiosity. He told the truth about how he'd found Elena. He didn't embellish the bad parts of what her life had been, because he didn't need to. The facts were sufficient, and facts stated plainly hit differently than facts stated dramatically. Mrs. Cutter, as it turned out, had been conducting her own campaign for the past 2 weeks without telling anyone. Wyatt discovered this when the feed store owner stopped him on the street and said he'd heard some things and apologized for being less than neighborly to Wyatt's wife. Wyatt thanked him without asking where he'd heard those things. He already knew. Ruth Callan's response arrived 12 days after they sent the letter. Elena opened it herself. Wyatt watched her read it. When she was finished, she sat still for a moment with the paper in her hands, and then she put it down on the table and pressed her palms flat on either side of it, the way you brace yourself on a surface when you need to feel something solid. "She'll testify," Elena said. "All right," Wyatt said. "She said—" Elena's voice was not quite steady. She got it back. "She said she's been waiting for someone to ask her, that she didn't know how to—" She stopped. "She said she's sorry it took this long." The room was quiet. Elena pressed her palms flat on the table and breathed, and Wyatt sat across from her and let the moment be what it was. Not comfortable, not happy, but real. Real in the way that things are real when the evidence of them is in your hands and can't be argued into something else. Outside the boarding house, Caldwell went about its afternoon business. Down the street at the hotel, Caleb Voss was presumably being reasonable in some direction or another. It didn't matter. For the first time since this had started, they had something he couldn't manage or spin or talk around. They had a witness who had been there. Elena looked up at Wyatt. Her eyes were bright in a way that wasn't quite tears and wasn't quite not. "We might actually do this," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think we might." The hearing was set for the second Tuesday of September, in the territorial courthouse at Bismarck. Greer had pushed for the venue, a deliberate choice, getting it out of Harding County where Caleb Voss had 15 years of relationships and the kind of quiet influence that doesn't announce itself but is felt in every room. Bismarck wasn't neutral ground exactly, but it was more neutral than anywhere in Caleb's established orbit, and Greer had taken what he could get. They rode out from Caldwell 4 days early. Wyatt, Elena, Lily, Greer, and Mrs. Alderman, who had announced without being asked that she was coming to help with the baby during the proceedings, and that nobody needed to discuss it. Mrs. Cutter had pressed food on them the morning they left with the same energy she brought to everything, which was to say, considerably more than the situation required and exactly as much as it needed. Ruth Callan was traveling from Harding County separately, under her own arrangement. Greer had spoken with her twice by letter and once in person, riding out to meet her at a point outside her husband's land. Not because her husband was opposed, Greer said, but because Caleb Voss had people in Harding County who noticed things, and there was no reason to advertise the testimony before it was delivered. The journey to Bismarck took 2 days. Elena was quiet for most of it, not the closed-off quiet of the early days in Caldwell, but something more inward, more working. Wyatt had come to know the difference. She was going over things, what she would say, what Harlow would ask, how she would hold up under questioning from a man whose entire professional skill was finding the place where a person's story bent and pressing on it until it cracked. On the second evening, when they'd made camp and Mrs. Alderman had Lily settled and Greer was reviewing his papers by the fire, Elena sat beside Wyatt a little apart from the others and said, "Tell me the worst version of how this goes." He looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "Tell me the worst realistic version, not the catastrophic one, the realistic worst." He thought about it seriously, because she'd asked seriously and she deserved that. Harlow damages Parrish's testimony enough that the medical evidence becomes disputed rather than established, he said. Ruth Callan's testimony gets characterized as the grievance of a neighbor with her own complaints about Voss, personal rather than factual. The bar fight in Renner and the wages dispute get used to build a picture of me as unstable, which reflects on the marriage and on the environment Lily would be raised in. The judge decides the safest ruling is to return Lily to Voss pending a fuller custody investigation, while the marriage question goes to further review. Elena was quiet. In that version, she said, he gets Lily. Temporarily, possibly. Greer says temporary custody arrangements get appealed and reversed more often than people expect. It wouldn't be permanent. Tell that to Lily. Her voice was flat. Not angry at him, just flat with the reality of it. Yes, he said. I know. She looked at the fire. A long moment passed. What's the best realistic version? She said. The medical records from Harding County arrive. Greer's request came back with confirmation they exist and are being produced. Parrish testifies to what he saw and what it told him, and his 30 years of practice make that testimony hard to attack on competence grounds. Ruth Callan gives specific dates, specific incidents, specific things she witnessed. Not interpretation, just what she saw. The judge looks at the pattern that produces and recognizes it for what it is. The marriage stands. Custody stays with you. She nodded slowly. The truth is somewhere between those two, she said. Usually is, he said. She pulled her knees up and wrapped her arms around them in a way he'd come to associate with her thinking. Not defensive, just contained. I used to rehearse conversations with him, she said. In my head. Every night for years I'd think about exactly what I'd say if I could. If there was a moment where I could say the true thing and have it matter. She paused. I never could. I was always better at it than me. He could take any true thing I said and turn it. He won't be asking the questions this time, Wyatt said. No. She rested her chin on her knees. Harlow will. Which might be worse because Harlow has no personal investment. He's just good at it. Greer is good at it too. I know. A pause. I trust Greer. She turned her head to look at him. I didn't think I'd be able to trust a lawyer. What changed your mind? He never once told me what he thought I should feel about any of it, she said. He just asked what happened and then figured out how to use it. She paused. That's what I needed. Not someone to manage my feelings. Someone to actually deal with the situation. Wyatt nodded. They sat with the fire for a while longer. Around them, the prairie was dark and enormous in the way it got at night out here. The sky too large, the stars too many. I'm scared, she said. She said it plainly, without any particular attempt to make it smaller than it was. He'd come to understand that this was its own kind of strength, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to name it accurately. I know, he said. Are you? He considered the question. Some, he said. Mostly I'm angry, but I've been keeping that useful. She almost smiled. Useful angry. It's the better kind. She did smile then, briefly, and it was the kind of smile that isn't about happiness, but about the specific relief of being in a situation with someone who is what they appear to be. Bismarck was larger than Caldwell by a factor that made Caldwell feel, in retrospect, like an outpost. The courthouse sat at the center of a proper town grid, 2 stories of territorial limestone that communicated, in the way institutional buildings do, that the proceedings inside it had weight and consequence. Wyatt had been in courtrooms before, twice. Once as a witness in a property dispute that had nothing to do with him except proximity, once in the aftermath of the Renner incident that Caleb's lawyers were now using against him. He knew what they felt like. They arrived the afternoon before the hearing. Harlow was already in town. Greer had expected this and mentioned it without particular worry, the way you mention weather that's already moving in your direction. Ruth Callan arrived that evening, on her own horse, with a small bag and the look of a woman who had made a decision she'd been putting off for years, and was surprised to find she felt steadier than she'd expected. Elena and Ruth saw each other in the hotel corridor, and Wyatt was close enough to witness it without being part of it. They stood for a moment looking at each other. Neither of them seemed to have prepared for this specific version of the reunion, the corridor, the hotel, the night before the hearing. Ruth was older than Elena by maybe 10 years, broad-shouldered, weathered in the particular way of women who worked land alongside their husbands without anyone calling it labor. You look well, Ruth said. Her voice was careful. Better than the last time you saw me, Elena said. Ruth nodded. The careful quality gave way to something more direct. How's the baby? She's good. She's healthy. Elena paused. Thank you for coming. I should have done something sooner, Ruth said. I knew I should. I just didn't know what. She glanced down the corridor and back. I know what now. Elena put her hand briefly on the older woman's arm. Nothing more than that. But Ruth Callan straightened slightly, like something had been adjusted. The hearing began at 9 in the morning. The judge was a man named Aldous Crane, 60, deliberate in his movements, with the exhausted patience of someone who had listened to a great many people tell him their versions of events, and had developed a precise internal instrument for measuring what those versions cost the teller. Greer had researched him and reported that he was not known for dramatic rulings, which cut both ways. Harlow was exactly what Elena had described. Medium height, unremarkable features, the kind of professional composure that reads as objectivity until you watched him work and understood. It wasn't objectivity at all, but a highly calibrated performance of it. He wore good clothes without wearing them noticeably. He addressed the judge with the particular ease of a man who had been in many courtrooms and found them comfortable. Caleb sat beside him at the plaintiff's table with the same unhurried certainty Wyatt had watched him carry through Caldwell's main street. He looked, to anyone assessing him quickly, like a concerned husband and father doing an unfortunate but necessary thing. Wyatt had spent the past several weeks watching that surface and knew what was underneath it, but he also knew that judges assessed surfaces first and had to work to get underneath them, and that Harlow's entire skill was keeping the surface intact. Greer opened by establishing the marriage, clean, factual, the dates and witnesses and documentation. He did not embellish. This was Wyatt had learned, his approach. Build the factual structure first, solid and unadorned, so that whatever came after had something to stand on. Harlow's opening characterized the marriage as a transaction of convenience entered into by a woman in a vulnerable mental state, facilitated by a man with a documented history of violent behavior, for the purpose of frustrating a legitimate legal claim. He said it pleasantly, without aggression, as if he were explaining a complicated situation rather than making an accusation. Wyatt listened to Harlow describe him and kept his face still and his hands flat on the table in front of him. Parrish testified first. He was, as Wyatt had hoped, excellent, not because he performed well, but because he didn't perform at all. He answered questions the way he did everything, with blunt, measured precision, and when Harlow tried to suggest that his notes were incomplete or his assessment of Elena's mental state at the time of the marriage was influenced by sympathy rather than clinical judgment, Parrish looked at him with 30 years of frontier medicine in his eyes and said, I've assessed patients in considerably worse conditions than Mrs. Mercer and made considerably harder calls. My notes reflect what I observed. If you want to challenge my methods, you're welcome to produce someone with more experience of concussion and dehydration in frontier conditions than I have, and we can compare. Harlow did not pursue that line. The medical records from Harding County arrived the morning of the hearing, produced reluctantly but completely by the doctor there, a younger man who, Greer suspected, was relieved to have been compelled rather than asked. 3 sets of treatment notes over 2 years. The broken finger listed as accidental. The bruised ribs, same notation. A 3rd visit for injuries to the face and neck that had been recorded as a fall from a horse. Greer put the records before Judge Crane and walked through each one. He noted the dates. He noted the language used. Accident, fall, consistent with household injury. And then he asked Judge Crane to observe the frequency. 3 significant injuries in 24 months, Greer said, each explained in a single phrase. No follow-up, no investigation, in a woman who had previously been in good health. Harlow objected on grounds of speculation. Crane sustained it but wrote something down, and Wyatt watched him write and thought that what you write down and what you sustain an objection about are not always the same thing. The Renner incident came up mid-morning. Harlow put a man named Doyle on the stand, one of the names from Caleb's character documentation, the one attached to the bar fight. Doyle was 50-ish, comfortably dressed, a man whose confidence suggested either genuine standing or the borrowed confidence of someone else's backing. He described the evening in Renner 4 years ago with the quality of recollection that has been recently polished, smooth in the places where genuine memory is usually rough. He described Wyatt as the aggressor, unprovoked, excessive. Greer cross-examined briefly and asked Doyle how he'd come to be in Bismarck to testify. Doyle said he'd been contacted by Caleb Voss's legal representative. Greer asked if his travel had been compensated. Doyle said his expenses had been covered. Greer thanked him and sat down. He'd told Wyatt in advance what he intended with that exchange. I'm not going to break his account, he'd said. I'm going to let the jury, the judge, do arithmetic. A witness who arrived because the plaintiff's lawyers called him and paid his way is a different kind of witness than one who arrived because they had something they needed to say. Wyatt testified before lunch. He sat in the witness chair and answered Greer's questions directly and without decoration. He described finding Elena and Lily. He described his decision to stay in Caldwell. He described the marriage and what it was and what it wasn't. And when Greer asked him why he'd done it, he said what was true, that Elena needed legal protection and he was in a position to provide it, and that somewhere in the process of providing it, he'd come to believe it was the right place for him to be. Then Harlow stood up. He was good. Wyatt had been told this, and now he experienced it directly. Harlow's questioning had a quality of apparent reasonableness. Each question seemed fair, seemed like the obvious next question, and the accumulation of them was designed to produce a picture that no single question could be called responsible for. He asked about Renner, about the wages dispute, about the speed of the marriage, about what Wyatt's financial situation had been when he entered Caldwell and what it was now. That last question was new. Wyatt answered it, his savings, honestly accounted for, and Greer objected to the relevance and Crane allowed it but asked Harlow to get to his point. Harlow's point, gently made, was that a man without property or land might find a different kind of value in aligning himself with a woman whose husband had 4,000 acres and might be persuaded to settle rather than litigate. The implication sat in the courtroom. Wyatt looked at Harlow and said, I knew Elena for 10 days before I married her. If I was looking for leverage on a rich man's property, that's the longest con in Dakota Territory history. Someone in the gallery made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Judge Crane didn't react, but his pen paused. Harlow moved on. After the midday recess, Elena testified. Wyatt watched her walk to the witness chair and sit down, and he watched the quality of how she did it. Straight-backed, deliberate, not performing steadiness, but actually in possession of it, which was a different thing and visible as such. She'd been afraid. She'd told him she was afraid. And she sat in that chair as if the fear was something she'd left in the corridor. Greer took her through it chronologically. The marriage to Caleb. The early years. The first incident. She gave a date. She gave the circumstances. She gave the specific language Caleb had used afterward, the specific way he had explained it to her, and eventually to himself. She did not editorialize. She stated what had happened in sequence, with the flat, careful precision of someone who had been over these events many times in private and had found that the plain truth was sufficient. The courtroom was very quiet. Greer asked about the 3 medical visits. She confirmed each one. She gave the actual cause of each injury, the actual circumstances, and this was the moment Wyatt had been waiting for, the thing Greer had built toward. She described the day before each visit. What had happened? What Caleb had said while it was happening, what he had said afterward. Harlow objected twice during this testimony. Crane overruled him both times. Then Harlow cross-examined. He was careful with her. Wyatt noted that Harlow understood that aggressive questioning of Elena in front of a judge who was already writing things down would be a mistake, so he wasn't aggressive. He was gentle, concerned even. His questions suggested he was worried about her, that he was looking for the truth on her behalf. It was a good performance. Wyatt sat at the table and watched Elena recognize it and handle it. Harlow asked about her state of mind in the weeks before she left. He used words like exhausted and overwhelmed, offered them to her as descriptions, waited to see if she'd accept them. She said, I was clear about what I needed to do. I had been clear about it for longer than I acted on it. He asked whether she'd discussed leaving with anyone, any friend or family member, before she made the decision. She said, people in my situation don't generally announce it in advance. He asked whether it was possible that some of her recollection of events had been affected by the stress of the journey, the dehydration, the concussion. She said, I gave you specific dates, specific words, specific sequences of events. If those are the recollections of a confused woman, Mr. Harlow, I'd be interested to know what a clear one looks like. The courtroom was quiet again. Harlow thanked her and sat down. Ruth Callan took the stand in the mid-afternoon. She was not a polished witness. She was not comfortable in the chair, not comfortable with Greer's careful framing questions. And when she spoke like a woman telling something to another person rather than performing testimony for a room. Wyatt thought that was probably the best thing about her. She described two specific incidents she had witnessed. The first was a morning 3 years ago when she had arrived at the Voss house. She'd brought eggs, she said. They exchanged eggs and garden produce as neighbors, a simple arrangement, and found Elena in the kitchen with her hair arranged carefully to cover the left side of her face, and a child's cup broken on the floor near the door, and Caleb Voss seated at the table eating breakfast with the peaceful absorption of a man who had just finished something and found it satisfactory. She'd said nothing. She'd left the eggs. She'd gone home and told herself it wasn't her business. The second incident was 8 months later. She'd seen Elena in the yard and stopped to talk, the ordinary talk of neighboring women, and at some point Elena had moved wrong, reached for something, twisted, and made a sound she immediately swallowed, and her face had gone through something in that half second that Ruth Callan said she hadn't been able to describe to anyone, but now she could. It was the face of a person who had learned to expect pain and whose expectation had been confirmed, and it was as ordinary to her as breathing. "I knew," Ruth said. "That's what I'm here to say. I knew and I did nothing, and I've had to live with that. I'm not living with it anymore." Harlow's cross-examination of Ruth was brief. He asked whether she had any direct knowledge, not impression, not interpretation, direct witness knowledge, of Mr. Voss striking his wife. Ruth said, "I told you what I saw. I'll let you interpret it." Harlow asked whether it was possible she had misread ordinary household situations through the lens of her own assumptions. Ruth looked at him for a moment with the flat, direct look of a woman who had spent 40 years in open country and had a highly accurate sense of what she was seeing at any given time. "No," she said. The day ended without a ruling. Crane said he needed time to review the documentation and would have a decision within 5 days. The courtroom emptied slowly, the way courtrooms do after proceedings that have produced more weight than anyone entirely knows what to do with. Wyatt found Elena outside on the courthouse steps. She was standing with her arms crossed, not against cold, the day was still warm, but against something internal, some holding in of what the day had produced. "You were right," she said when he came up beside her. "About what?" "It was harder than walking 9 miles. She looked at the street. "But I didn't fall apart." "No," he said, "you didn't." She uncrossed her arms, let them fall to her sides, a deliberate release. "Harlow is going to make a written argument tonight," she said. "Greer told me. Probably try one more angle on the marriage." "Greer is ready for that." "I know." She looked at him. "I keep waiting for the part where I trust that things are going to be all right. Where I can just relax into it." "Does it come?" he asked. He was genuinely asking. She thought about it seriously. "I don't know," she said. "I've never been anywhere it was safe to find out." He didn't say anything to that. They stood on the courthouse steps as Bismarck went about its late afternoon business around them, and after a while Elena unclenched her hands. He noticed she still did this deliberate unwinding of tension from her fingers, one at a time, and said, "Wherever Lily is right now, Mrs. Alderman has her, and she's fine." "Yes," Wyatt said. "I keep reminding myself of that. It helps." "Good." They stayed a little longer. Then they walked back toward the hotel, side by side, not touching, not speaking, two people who had gone into something difficult together and had come out the other side of it still standing. It was not resolution. The ruling wasn't in. Harlow was working somewhere in a Bismarck hotel room with his precise, patient skill. Caleb Voss was presumably being reasonable in some direction. But they were standing. Greer found them at dinner that evening with a look on his face that Wyatt had not seen before, which was the expression of a man who has received information that has shifted his assessment of the situation. "The Harding County medical records," he said, sitting down and keeping his voice low. "I went through them again this afternoon. There's a notation I missed in the first pass. It's not in Elena's file. It's in a general register the doctor kept, a second book he used for his own reference." He paused. "There's an entry from 2 years ago. The doctor wrote, in his own private notation, not the official record, that he believed the injury he was treating was not consistent with the stated cause, and that he had concerns about the patient's home situation." He looked at Elena. "He wrote your name." Elena went very still. "He wrote it down," she said. "He never did anything with it. He was afraid to. But he wrote it." Greer straightened. "That private notation is documentary evidence from a third party, in his own hand at the time, without any subsequent interest or motive. It is, he chose his word, it is significant. The table was quiet. Elena looked at Wyatt. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything, because sometimes the thing that needs to be felt needs a moment before it can be spoken. And this was that moment. The particular, almost painful thing that happens when the evidence you needed finally exists and is finally in the right hands, and the fight you've been fighting for longer than it should have taken suddenly has a different weight to it. All right, Elena said, finally, quietly. All right, right? Greer nodded and reached for the breadbasket with the practical motion of a man moving on to the next thing, because there was still a ruling to wait for and a night to get through, and the work was not done yet. But something had shifted, and they all three felt it, sitting in that Bismarck dining room with the sounds of a larger world moving around them. Something shifting, something old and heavy beginning, slowly, to move. Crane's ruling came on the fourth day. Not the fifth, as he'd said. The fourth, which Greer interpreted as a sign that the additional documentation had simplified rather than complicated his thinking, that the private notation in the Harding County Doctor's Register had done what Greer had hoped it would do, which was to remove the ambiguity that Harlow had been counting on. When the evidence is disputed, a judge has room to go either direction and call it balanced. When a third party puts something in his own private book at the time of the event, with no audience and no motive except the discomfort of a man who knew what he was looking at and couldn't entirely silence himself, that is a different category of evidence, and Crane was experienced enough to know the difference. The ruling was delivered in writing, not in open court. Greer received it at the courthouse clerk's office and brought it back to the hotel and set it on the table in front of Elena and Wyatt without saying anything first, which itself said something. Elena read it. Wyatt watched her face. She read it twice. Then she put it down, flat on the table, both palms resting on either side of it, the way she'd held Ruth Callan's letter. That gesture of needing something solid underneath her hands when the thing she was feeling was too large to hold otherwise. The marriage is upheld, she said. Yes, Greer said. Custody stays with me. With both of you, technically, but primary custody, yes. She was quiet. Her breathing was slow and deliberate, the breathing of someone managing something significant. What about Caleb? Wyatt asked. Greer sat down across from them. Crane found insufficient grounds to contest the marriage. He found the character testimony against you. He nodded at Wyatt, unpersuasive in the context of the full record. He noted the medical evidence and Ruth Callan's testimony and the doctor's private notation and concluded that the pattern they collectively described was, in his words, consistent with a history of domestic harm that justified Mrs. Mercer's departure and the subsequent legal arrangements made for her protection. He paused. He used the word harm. That matters. It's in the record now. Elena's jaw tightened, not against grief, against something else. The particular thing that happens when you have been told for years that what you experienced wasn't real, and then someone with authority writes it down in official language and says, "It was real, it happened, here is its name." Caleb doesn't get access to Lily, she said. The ruling doesn't grant him visitation. If he wants to pursue that, it would require a separate proceeding, and he would be doing so against a record that now contains the word harm and a documented pattern. Greer laced his fingers on the table. My assessment is that he won't. Harlow will have told him the same thing. The cost of pursuing it further, against what's now on record, is higher than the likely outcome. He'll cut his losses, Wyatt said. That's my expectation. Elena looked at the ruling on the table, at the words on it that she'd read twice, and that had not changed between the first reading and the second. He's not going to accept it, she said. Not inside. He's going to believe he was wronged. Probably, Greer said, but he's going to leave us alone. He has very strong financial reasons too, Greer said. And whatever else he is, Caleb Voss is practical about his financial reasons. She nodded slowly. Then she looked at Wyatt, and the look on her face was something he hadn't seen on her before. Not happiness, not relief in the released, easy sense of the word. Something more complicated. The face of a person who has been fighting for so long that the cessation of fighting feels unfamiliar, feels almost like a loss of structure, because the structure of the fight was the thing that had been holding them upright. It's over, she said, testing the words. The legal part, he said. Yes. She understood the distinction. She'd always understood it, that a court ruling couldn't reach into the places where the damage had actually been done, couldn't rewrite the years, couldn't give back what had been spent surviving them. She knew that. But she also knew that the legal part was what had been between Lily and Caleb Voss, and that part was done, and that was the thing that mattered most. She reached across the table and picked up the ruling and folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close against her body, where she kept things she needed to keep safe. They left Bismarck the following morning. Caleb Voss had already gone. Greer mentioned it in passing. The hotel clerk had told him, the kind of information that moves through a small professional community without particular announcement. Caleb had checked out that morning, early, taken his good horse, and ridden north toward Harding County. No farewell. No final conversation. Nothing that could be quoted or used. Wyatt had not expected anything different. Caleb Voss did not do dramatic exits. He did quiet withdrawals that looked, from the outside, like a man simply moving on to other business. Elena said nothing when Greer mentioned it, and Wyatt didn't either. The ride back to Caldwell took 2 days, same as the ride out, but it felt different in a way that was difficult to articulate. Not lighter, exactly. The weight wasn't gone, but it had changed character. It was no longer the weight of something unresolved pressing forward into an uncertain future. It was the weight of what had happened, which was a different thing entirely. You could carry the past differently than you could carry the future. The past was at least a fixed quantity. Mrs. Alderman kept Lily entertained for the duration with the inexhaustible patience of a woman who had made it her life's work and found it genuinely sufficient. Lily was 4 weeks old now, almost 5, and had begun doing the thing that very young babies do when they start to be actually present in the world, tracking faces, making sounds that were responses rather than just needs. She watched the landscape go by with the absolute, unself-conscious attention of something that hasn't yet learned to ration its curiosity. On the second evening, with Caldwell perhaps 4 hours ahead of them, and the sunset going orange and wide across the flats, Elena shifted Lily to one arm and reached over and put her free hand briefly over Wyatt's, where it rested on his knee. Not long. A few seconds. Then she took it back. He didn't remark on it. She didn't either. But it stayed with him the rest of the ride in the way that small, unannounced things sometimes do, not because they're dramatic, but because they're true. Caldwell received them with the particular quality of reception that a small town gives to people who left under difficult circumstances and have returned. Not celebration, not ceremony, just the gradual accumulation of acknowledgement. Mrs. Cutter at the boarding house door with a straightforwardness that communicated she had always expected this outcome, and had simply been waiting for the world to catch up with her assessment. The feed store owner who had apologized to Wyatt before the hearing stopped him on the street the day after their return, and shook his hand with the slightly extra firmness of a man making up for something without being able to say so directly. Parrish came by that evening and sat with them for an hour, and drank coffee and talked about things that had nothing to do with courts or rulings, which was itself a form of normalcy that felt, after everything, almost extraordinary. Ruth Callan had gone back to Harding County. She'd written a short letter to Elena before leaving Bismarck. Not long, not effusive, just the direct communication of a woman who had said what she needed to say in a courtroom and didn't need to say much more. The last line was, "I hope you plant something. Things you plant yourself always feel more like yours." Elena read that line to Wyatt one evening and didn't say anything afterward, and he didn't either, but he thought about it for days. The weeks after the ruling were not easy in the ways that resolutions in stories are often portrayed as easy. There was no moment where Elena woke up healed. There was no morning where the history of 4 years simply receded into a place where it no longer had weight. She knew that and Wyatt knew that, and they had, tacitly, agreed not to pretend otherwise. What there was instead was smaller and more actual, daily life building itself one day at a time, in the way that daily life does when you let it. She was not a woman who sat still well. Wyatt discovered this in the weeks after Bismarck, when the immediate crisis had passed, and she had time that wasn't structured around survival, and the time revealed a restlessness in her that she'd probably always had, and that the previous 4 years had suppressed. She wanted to be doing something. She wanted to be making something that was hers. She started with the children. It began practically. Mrs. Alderman's granddaughter had fallen behind in her letters, and Elena had offered to help, and the help had turned into a regular afternoon arrangement in Mrs. Cutter's sitting room. then two more children, then four. Then a father asked whether she might have time for his son, who was 9 and could not yet read, and whose older brothers found this funny in a way that was not kind, and Elena said yes, and worked with the boy 3 afternoons a week until he could read a sentence and then a paragraph and then a full page. And the look on his face when he read that full page, not to Elena, not to his father, but aloud to himself, like testing something he still half disbelieved, was a thing she described to Wyatt that evening with more animation than he'd seen from her before, her hands moving, her voice having the particular quality of a person who has found something they didn't know they were looking for. "You should have a proper space," he said. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "For teaching, not Mrs. Cutter's sitting room." He'd been thinking about it for a week. "There's a building on the east side of Maine that's sitting empty. The man who owns it has been trying to rent it for 6 months and hasn't found a use for it. I can't afford. We can negotiate the rent against other considerations. Greer told me there's a territorial provision for schooling infrastructure. They'll support it financially if it's structured right." She was quiet, absorbing this. "That's a real school," she said. "Yes. I'm not a trained school teacher." "You taught that boy to read," he said. "What do you think a school teacher does?" She gave him the look she sometimes gave him when he said something that was technically correct, and she wasn't ready to agree with it yet. He had come to like that look. "It would take work," she said. "Yes. I don't know if Caldwell even wants. 3 families have already asked me about it," he said. "I wasn't going to mention it until you brought the idea up yourself, but since you're arguing against it, I figure you should know." She blinked. "You were waiting for me to bring it up?" "You would have," he said. "You were already thinking about it. I could tell." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully categorize, and then she looked away and out the window and said, "You're very irritating sometimes." "I've been told." She almost laughed. The building on East Main was secured at the end of October through a negotiation that Greer handled with his usual thoroughness, and that involved the territorial provision Wyatt had mentioned, plus a modest monthly arrangement that was within what they could manage. Elena spent 3 weeks cleaning it and arranging it and making lists of what was needed, and Wyatt watched her do it with the focused, planning energy of someone who had been given a legitimate territory to organize and was discovering what she was capable of when the thing she was building was genuinely hers. Mrs. Cutter donated 4 chairs. The general store owner provided a small blackboard at cost. Parrish contributed a set of reading primers he'd been keeping in his back room for 20 years against some anticipated future use that had apparently arrived. 3 families sent their children on the first morning, and 2 more appeared by the end of the week, and by December Elena was teaching 9 children of various ages in a room that smelled of fresh-swept wood and chalk. It was not a perfect school. She was figuring out what she was doing as she did it, which meant some days were better than others, which meant there were evenings when she came back to the boarding house. They were still at the boarding house, a situation that was becoming more complicated by the week in ways neither of them had fully addressed, and sat down and said flatly that she had done 3 things wrong and needed to think about how to do them differently. She didn't ask for reassurance on those evenings. That was one of the things about her he'd come to understand. She wanted to think through what had gone wrong, not be told it was fine. She thought out loud sometimes, working through the problem while he listened, and when she'd found the answer, she'd stop and say something else entirely, as if the problem had been taken care of and filed and was no longer the present business. He found this efficient, and also, if he was being honest with himself, he found it something more than that. He found it the specific thing you find when you spend enough time with a person and begin to understand how they are actually built, not just how they appear, and the actual building is something you can respect. They were not a conventional marriage. They both understood that. The boarding house rooms remained separate, and there were aspects of their arrangement that remained unspoken by mutual and unannounced agreement, because neither of them was ready to speak them, and neither of them was sure what speaking them would produce. Wyatt did not push. It was not in his nature to push, and even if it had been, he understood that Elena had spent 4 years in a situation where the thing she felt was irrelevant to the decisions being made about her life, and that rebuilding any kind of trust in her own judgment about what she wanted, not what was safe, not what was practical, but what she actually wanted, was a slow process that she had to run herself. He let her run it. In the meantime, there was a life, and the life was more than he'd had in a long time, and he found that it was enough. He took work where it was available, some carpentry, some livestock management for a rancher north of town who was getting old and needed capable hands more than he needed a full-time employee. He was not a man built for idleness, and he was not a man who required a great deal of acknowledgement for the work he did, which turned out to suit Caldwell well, because Caldwell was a town that valued quiet usefulness over performance. He built a shelf for Elena's schoolroom in early November. She'd mentioned needing storage for the primers, and he'd measured the wall and done the work on a Saturday while the school was empty. When she came in Monday morning and found it, she ran her hand along the wood the way you touch something you're trying to believe is real, and then turned around and said, "That's exactly right." Not thank you. That's exactly right. He understood that was its own kind of language and that it meant more than thank you, and he was satisfied with it. Lily changed everything, the way very young children do, not in dramatic moments, but in the daily accumulation of being present and growing. By October, she was doing the things 2-month-old babies do, sleeping longer, waking with opinions, watching faces with the deep animal seriousness of someone who is processing more than she can yet express. By December, she had a laugh, a real one, not the reflex laugh of a newborn, but an actual responsive laugh that she produced when Wyatt made a specific sound she'd decided was funny, which he discovered by accident and repeated on purpose to see if it would work again, and it did. He hadn't expected that. The laugh. The specific way it landed somewhere in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the practical decision he'd made in Parrish's office about what this marriage was and what it wasn't. He thought about that sometimes. About the gap between what you decide and what you feel, and how the second thing doesn't ask the first thing's permission. One evening in January, when the cold had settled into Caldwell with the flat, serious intent of a Dakota winter, Wyatt came back from the rancher's place to find Elena at the boarding house sitting room table with Lily asleep in a basket beside her, and a sheet of paper in front of her with writing on it that she covered slightly when he came in, and then, after a moment, uncovered. "I'm writing to my cousin," she said. "In Wyoming." "The one you haven't spoken to in 3 years?" "Yes." She looked at the letter. "I've started it 4 times. I don't know what to say about what's happened. There's too much of it." He sat down across from her. "What do you want to say?" She thought about it. "That I'm all right," she said. "That Lily is healthy. That—" She paused. "That I built something. That I'm in a place where what I do matters, and I get to decide what I do." She looked up at him. "That's what I want to say. I don't know how to get there through everything else." "Start with the school," he said. "Start with what you built. The rest can come after." She looked at him. "Sometimes you say the right thing," she said. "Don't get used to it," he said. She turned back to the letter, and he watched her write for a while. The particular absorption of a person who has found the thread. And the room was warm and quiet, and Lily slept in her basket with the deep, untroubled sleep of someone who does not yet know that the world is difficult, who knows only that she is fed and warm and that the people nearby are familiar and safe. Wyatt thought about a sound in the grass, the thin, irregular cry that he'd almost processed as the ordinary noise of open country, and then hadn't. He thought about the arithmetic of it, the small series of choices that had looked, each one individually, like nothing much, and that had accumulated into this. This room, this warmth, this woman writing a letter at the table, this baby who made a laugh out of a specific sound he'd found by accident. He was not a man who thought much in terms of what things meant. He was practical in his orientation, inclined to deal with the present and leave the meaning of it to people who were better equipped for that kind of thinking. But sitting in that room in January with the cold pressing against the windows and everything inside the room at a specific quality of settled, he permitted himself to notice that this was a life, a real one, with texture and difficulty and people in it who were actual people, flawed, complicated, not what he'd expected, not what he'd planned for. He'd planned for nothing. He'd been heading toward Caldwell for no reason more significant than running out of reasons to be anywhere else. And then he'd turned his horse. That was the whole thing, really. The whole of it reduced to that. A man who turned his horse toward a sound instead of away from it. Not because he was heroic, not because he was certain, because the sound was there, and he was there, and not stopping felt wrong in a way he couldn't argue himself out of. He didn't think of himself as the kind of man who changed things. He was not built for that kind of self-assessment, but he thought, sitting in that room, watching Elena write her letter, that sometimes the most significant thing a person does is not the large thing, not the thing they prepared for, or that asked something enormous of them. Sometimes it's the small refusal to keep going when something says stop, the willingness to be inconvenienced by someone else's crisis, the decision to still be in the chair when morning comes. He'd stayed in the chair. Everything else had followed from that. Elena finished the letter. She folded it and set it aside and reached into the basket and adjusted the blanket over Lily with the automatic careful motion of a woman who'd been doing this long enough that it had become part of the physical vocabulary of her daily life. She did it without looking, the way you reach for something in the dark that you know is there. Then she sat back and looked at him. "I want to talk about the boarding house rooms," she said. He met her eyes. "All right," he said. "It's been long enough," she said. "I know what I want, and I know what I want." She said it with the particular firmness of a woman who has spent a long time learning to trust her own knowledge about that question and is done being tentative about the answers. "I'm not asking for anything that looks like before. I'm not asking to go back to any version of Elena," he said quietly. She stopped. "I know," he said. "I know what you're saying." She was quiet for a moment. "You've been waiting," she said. "Yes. Without making me feel it." "You had enough to carry without that." She looked at him for a long time, and in her face was the complicated thing that had been building for months through the small daily accumulations. The shelf, the letter, the laugh, the evenings of working through problems aloud, the hand briefly over his hand on the ride home from Bismarck. The thing that had been growing without either of them naming it, because the naming of it needed to wait until she was on ground solid enough to stand on when she said it. She was on that ground now. "I'm not going to be easy," she said. It was what she'd told him in Caldwell before the marriage, the same words, but different in weight now. Not a warning, exactly. More an honest accounting. "I'm going to get it wrong sometimes. I'm going to close off when I should open up, and push back when I should just—" "Elena," he said again. She stopped again. "I have a bad temper," he said. "I spent 8 years not building anything because it was easier than the risk of it. I'm going to get it wrong too." He held her gaze. "That's fine. That's what people do." She was quiet. Then she said, "Okay." Just that. He nodded. Outside, the January wind moved against the windows. Lily slept. The letter to the cousin in Wyoming sat folded on the table, ready to be sent. Spring came to Caldwell, the way it comes to Dakota country. Slowly, then suddenly, the cold giving ground in stages, and then all at once, the grass coming back in a green that was almost violent after the flat gray of winter. Elena's school had 14 students by April. She'd negotiated with the Territorial Education Board in March through a process that involved Greer and a considerable amount of correspondence and the particular stubborn patience she brought to things she'd decided mattered. The negotiation produced a modest stipend and official recognition, which she said she didn't care about personally, but which she wanted for the school because it would outlast her opinion of it. Wyatt had moved his things down the hall by February. Not ceremoniously. He'd simply carried them, room to room, and that had been that. They were not the same people they'd been. That was worth saying clearly, because it was true, and also because it was not a complaint. It was not the man who'd been heading toward Caldwell with no reason to stop. She was not the woman who'd covered her face at breakfast to hide what was underneath. They'd changed each other in the way that proximity to real things changes you. Not smoothly, not without friction, but genuinely. There were bad evenings. Evenings when something would catch her wrong. A tone of voice, a moment where she felt cornered by something that wasn't actually a corner. And she'd go inside herself in the old way, the wall coming up fast, and he'd learn to recognize it and to give her the room to come back out on her own rather than trying to pull her out, which was the instinct and also the wrong thing. She always came back. She came back differently each time, slightly different from before. Not more healed, because that wasn't the right frame for it, but more capable of recognizing the pattern and choosing something else. He wasn't without his own difficulties. He'd spent 8 years in a version of isolation that he'd told himself was freedom, and the actual work of being present to another person's daily life, the real texture of it, the maintenance of it, The fact that it required attention even on the days when nothing dramatic was happening. That was harder than he'd admitted to himself it would be. There were days he felt the old pull. The next town, the open road, the simple arithmetic of a man and a horse and no obligations. He felt the pull, and he stayed. He stayed because staying was the choice he'd made, and because he understood, in the clear-eyed way he understood most things, that the pull was not actually about freedom, it was about fear. And he was not going to organize his life around fear. Ruth Callan wrote to Elena in April. A real letter this time, longer than the one from Bismarck, with the news from Harding County that Caleb Voss had sold 2,000 acres of his land in March and was making arrangements that suggested he was preparing to relocate. She didn't speculate on why, she just reported it. Elena read the letter and put it on the table and said, "Good." One word. But she said it with a breath that had been held for a long time. One afternoon in May, when the school was closed for the afternoon, and the day had settled into the warm, unhurried quality that late spring produces in open country, Elena found Wyatt in the yard behind the building they'd rented. A real building now, not the boarding house. A house at the edge of Caldwell, with enough room and a yard with a fence that needed work, and a window in the kitchen that let in the afternoon light in a way that made the whole room a different color. She was carrying Lily, who was 7 months old now and had opinions about being carried that she expressed freely. She put Lily down on the blanket she'd spread on the grass. Lily immediately applied herself to a detailed investigation of the ground, which was her primary occupation, and sat down on the fence rail near where Wyatt was working. She watched him work for a while. "I talked to a woman today," she said. "She came by the school. Her daughter is 7. She wants to start in the fall." "Good." She was asking about the school, the structure of it, and I was explaining. She paused. And in the middle of it, I realized I was talking about it the way you talk about something that's yours. Not careful, not provisional, just mine. He looked up from the fence board he was setting. "It is yours," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm saying. I know that now in a way I didn't 6 months ago." She looked at Lily on the blanket, who had located something of great interest in the grass and was bringing it toward her mouth, in the way of someone very certain about her next move. "She's doing that thing," Elena said. "I'll get it," Wyatt said, and he was already moving, arriving at Lily with the speed of someone who had learned to track this particular development and intercept it reliably, retrieving the item from Lily's vicinity over her frank and vocal objection. Elena watched him negotiate with the 7-month-old about the item's unsuitability, which was not a negotiation so much as a replacement. He found a different thing, something without the liability of the first thing, and offered it, and Lily considered her options and accepted, with the pragmatism of someone who knows what she can and can't win. He sat down in the grass near Lily. He did this sometimes, just sat with her, not doing anything particular, just being in the same space. Elena had noticed it months ago, how it had changed, how he'd gone from a man who was careful with the baby because she was fragile and he didn't know how to hold things gently to a man who simply sat in the grass with her because that was where she was. She thought about what that had cost him to become, what it cost anyone to become something other than the shape their life had made them. It was not a small thing. People talked about change as if it were a door you walked through, as if there were a moment on one side and a different moment on the other, and the passage between them were clean. It wasn't like that. It was accumulated and daily, and it required, again and again, the choice to stay when leaving was available and familiar. She had made that choice. He had made that choice. They had made it on different days for different reasons, and continued to make it, quietly, without ceremony, in the ordinary accumulation of a life being built. That was the thing she had not known before, that a life was not found. It was not handed to you, and it was not the thing you arrived at when the difficulty was over. It was made, in the daily making of it, out of what was present and what was chosen. She had been present. She had chosen. She thought about the woman she'd been in that kitchen, the divorce papers, the quiet voice, the way he'd held Lily like a thing he wasn't sure he wanted. She thought about the grass on the flats, and the sound Lily had made, fading in and out like a signal losing its source. She thought about a man she hadn't known turning his horse. Everything had followed from that, but not because of fate, not because of any mechanism outside the human one, because a person had made a choice, and then another person had made a choice, and then the choices had compounded into something neither of them had planned for or could have designed in advance. You survived alone. That part was true. Survival was solitary in its mechanism, in the deep engine of it. But a life was not survivable alone. A life required witnesses. It required people who saw you clearly and stayed anyway. Not because you were easy, not because you were uncomplicated, but because you were real, and they had decided that real was worth the staying. Lily looked up from her investigation of the approved item and found Elena's face and made a sound. Not language yet, not even close, but directed, intentional. The specific sound of someone who has identified the person she was looking for. Elena got down from the fence rail and sat in the grass. Lily moved toward her with the full-body determination of someone who has not yet learned to walk, and has therefore not yet learned to be embarrassed about the alternatives. She arrived. She grabbed Elena's sleeve and looked up at her with the complete, unself-conscious satisfaction of something that has gotten exactly where it intended to go. Wyatt watched them. He thought about the road he'd been on. All the roads, really. 8 years of them. All the towns he'd passed through and the people he'd not quite connected with, and the life he'd been heading nowhere in particular to live. He thought about the specific randomness of which road, which afternoon, which particular angle of July heat that had pushed a woman and her baby into the shade of a depression in the grass exactly where he happened to be riding. He didn't think it was destiny. He wasn't built for that kind of thinking. He thought it was chance that had handed him a choice, and the choice had been his, and he had made it without knowing what it meant. And it had meant this. That was enough. That was more than enough. The afternoon light moved across the yard. Lily made her sound. Elena answered it in the low, specific voice she used with her, and the voice was easy in a way it hadn't been. In a way it couldn't have been, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, a year ago, on the kitchen floor of a house in Harding County, with the quiet, certain voice of a dangerous man in the next room. She was not that woman anymore. She was also not that woman. She carried her, she would always carry her, the version who had endured and calculated and survived. But she was not only her. She had become also this, a woman in the grass in May, in a town she'd chosen, with a child who knew her face, and a man sitting nearby who had turned his horse. Wyatt stretched his legs out and tipped his face up toward the sun, the way a man does when he is where he intends to be and has stopped looking at the horizon for the next place. He was not a man who said much about what he felt. He suspected he never would be. But he had learned in the months since Caldwell that saying a thing and meaning it were not the same thing, and that some meanings were communicated better by staying than by speaking. He was still there. That was the whole of what he had to say. And it was, it turned out, exactly enough.